Book 4 Discipline and Breeding. I. Order of rank. What determines rank, sets off rank, is only quanta of power, and nothing else. Order of rank as order of power, war and danger the presupposition for a rank to retain the conditions of its existence. What determines your rank is the quantum of power you are, the rest is cowardice. How could one sacrifice the development of mankind to help a higher species than man to come into existence? The terrible consequence of equality finally, everyone believes he has a right to every problem. All order of rank has vanished. The annihilation of suffrage universal, i.e., the system through which the lowest natures prescribe themselves as laws for the higher, the annihilation of mediocrity and its acceptance. 2. The strong and the weak. Why the weak conquer? In summa, the sick and weak have more sympathy, are more humane. The sick and weak have more spirit, are more changeable, various, entertaining, more malicious. It was the sick who invented malice. The sick and weak have had fascination on their side, they are more interesting than the healthy, the fool and the saint, the two most interesting kinds of man closely related to them, the genius. The great adventurers and criminals and all men, especially the healthiest, are sick at certain periods in their lives. The rise of the mob signifies once again the ascendancy of the old values. Such an extreme movement in respect of tempo and means as our civilization represents, shifts men's center of gravity, those men who matter most, who have, as it were, the task of compensating for the vast danger of such a morbid movement. They will become procrastinators par excellence, slow to adopt, reluctant to let go, and relatively enduring in the midst of this tremendous change and mixture of elements. In such circumstances, the center of gravity necessarily shifts to the mediocre, against the dominion of the mob and of the eccentric. Both are usually united. Mediocrity consolidates itself as the guarantee and bearer of the future. Thus emerges a new opponent for exceptional men or a new seduction. Provided they do not accommodate themselves to the mob and try to flatter the instincts of the disinherited, they will have to be mediocre and solid. They know, mediocrity is also gold indeed, it alone disposes of money and gold, of all that glitters, and once more the old virtue, and the entire dated world of the ideal in general, gains a body of gifted advocates. Result. Mediocrity acquires spirit, wit, genius, it becomes entertaining, it seduces. Result. A high culture can stand only upon a broad base, upon a strong and healthy consolidated mediocrity. Science and even art work in its service and are served by it. Science could not wish for a better situation, it belongs as such to a mediocre kind of man. It is out of place among the exceptional. It has nothing aristocratic, and even less anything anarchistic, in its instinct. The power of the middle is, further, upheld by trade, above all trade in money. The instinct of great financiers goes against everything extreme. That is why the Jews are at present the most conserving power in our intensely threatened and insecure Europe. They can have no use for revolution, socialism, or militarism, if they desire and employ power, even over the revolutionary party. This is only a consequence of the aforesaid and not a contradiction. They need occasionally to arouse fear of other extreme tendencies by demonstrating how much power they have in their hands. But their instinct itself is unswervingly conservative and mediocre. Wherever there is power, they know how to be powerful, but the employment of their power is always in one direction. The honorable term for mediocre is, of course, the word liberal. Reflection. It is absurd to assume that this whole victory of values is anti-biological. One must try to explain it in terms of an interest life has in preserving the type man even through this method of the dominance of the weak and underprivileged. Otherwise, man would cease to exist. Problem. The enhancement of the type fatal for the preservation of the species. Why? History shows, the strong races decimate one another, through war, thirst for power, adventurousness, the strong affects, wastefulness. Strength is no longer hoarded, spiritual disturbance arises through excessive tension, their existence is costly, in brief they ruin one another. Periods of profound exhaustion and torpor supervene, all great ages are paid, or the strong are subsequently weaker, more devoid of will, more absurd than the weak average. They are races that squander. Duration as such has no value. One might well prefer a shorter but more valuable existence for the species. It would remain to be proved that, even so, a richer yield of value would be gained than in the case of the shorter existence, i.e., that man as summation of strength acquires a much greater quantum of mastery over things. If life is as it is, we stand before a problem of economics. An attitude that calls itself idealism and that will not allow mediocrity to be mediocre, or woman to be woman, no uniformity. Let us be clear how dearly a virtue is bought, and that virtue is not something of average desirability, but a noble madness, a beautiful exception, with the privilege of strong feelings. What I combat is economic optimism, as if increasing expenditure of everybody must necessarily involve the increasing welfare of everybody. The opposite seems to me to be the case. Expenditure of everybody amounts to a collective loss. Man is diminished so one no longer knows what aim this tremendous process has served. An aim? A new aim, that is what humanity needs. The mediocrity of weaker natures has been confused with the moderation of the strong. In summa, The best things have been slandered because the weak or the immoderate swine have cast a bad light on them, and the best men have remained hidden and have often misunderstood themselves. The Church has excommunicated German emperors on account of their vices, as if a monk or priest had any right to join in a discussion about what a Friedrich II may demand of himself. The rights a man arrogates to himself are related to the duties he imposes upon himself, to the tasks to which he feels equal. The great majority of men have no right to existence, but are a misfortune to higher men. Egoism. It is precisely the non-ego, the profoundly average creature, the species man, who desires to preserve himself. If this is perceived by rarer, subtler, and less average men, it enrages them. For they judge, we are nobler. Our preservation is more important than that of those cattle. The lowest man is worth more than that man up there. And the way was prepared for an image of God that was as remote as possible from the image of the most powerful, the God on the cross. What is essential and valuable in such higher men were their capacity for setting masses in motion, in short, their effect. But the higher nature of the great man lies in being different, in incommunicability, in distance of rank, not in an effect of any kind, even if he made the whole globe tremble. One recognizes the superiority of the Greek man and the Renaissance man, but one would like to have them without the causes and conditions that made them possible. First question concerning order of rank: how solitary or how gregarious one is. In the latter case, one's value resides in the qualities that secure the survival of one's herd, one's type; in the former, in that which distinguishes, isolates, defends one, and makes one's solitariness possible. Consequence, one should not evaluate the solitary type from the viewpoint of the gregarious, nor the gregarious from the viewpoint of the solitary. Viewed from a height, both are necessary, their antagonism is also necessary, and nothing should be banished more thoroughly than the desirability that some third thing might evolve out of the two, virtue as hermaphroditism. That is as little desirable as the approximation and reconciliation of the sexes. To evolve further that which is typical, to make the gulf wider and wider concept of degeneration in both cases, when the herd starts to acquire the qualities of the solitary, and the latter the qualities of the herd; in short, when they approximate each other. This concept of degeneration has nothing to do with moral evaluation. To learn something that is of no concern to us, and to find one's duty precisely in this objective activity, to learn to value pleasure and duty as altogether separate things, that is the invaluable task and achievement of higher schooling. How can something disagreeable become agreeable? For example, when our obedience, our submission to the law, attain honor through the strength, power, self-overcoming they entail. As do our consideration for the community, the neighbor, the fatherland, our humanization, our altruism, heroism. That one should like to do disagreeable things, that is the object of ideals. The dwarfing of man must for a long time count as the only goal, because a broad foundation has first to be created so that a stronger species of man can stand upon it. To what extent every strengthened species of man hitherto has stood upon a level of the lower. What one fight against, that an exceptional type should make war on the rule instead of grasping that the continued existence of the rule is the precondition for the value of the exception. For example, the ladies who, instead of feeling their abnormal thirst for scholarship as a distinction, want to disrupt the status of woman in general. The increase of force despite the temporary decline of the individual, to establish a new level, a method of assembling forces for the preservation of small achievements, in opposition to uneconomic waste, destructive nature temporarily subdued as an instrument for this future economy, preservation of the weak, because a tremendous number of petty tasks have to be performed, preservation of an attitude of mind that makes existence still possible for the weak and suffering, to implant solidarity. As an instinct against the instinct of fear and servility, struggle against accident, also against the accident of great men. The increasing dwarfing of man is precisely the driving force that brings to mind the breeding of a stronger race, a race that would be excessive precisely where the dwarfed species was weak and growing weaker, in will, responsibility, self-assurance, ability to posit goals for oneself. The means would be those history teaches, isolation through interests in preservation that are the reverse of those which are average today, habituation to reverse evaluations, distance as a pathos, a free conscience in those things that today are most undervalued and prohibited. The homogenizing of European man is the great process that cannot be obstructed, one should even hasten it. The necessity to create a gulf, distance, order of rank, is given eo ipso, not the necessity to retard this process. As soon as it is established, this homogenizing species requires a justification; it lies in serving a higher sovereign species that stands upon the former and can raise itself to its task only by doing this. Not merely a master race whose sole task is to rule, but a race with its own sphere of life, with an excess of strength for beauty, bravery, culture, manners to the highest peak of the spirit, an affirming race that may grant itself every great luxury, strong enough to have no need of the tyranny of the virtue imperative, rich enough to have no need of thrift and pedantry, beyond good and evil, a hothouse for strange and choice plants. Main consideration, not to see the task of the higher species in leading the lower, as, example Comte does, but the lower as a base upon which higher species performs its own tasks upon which alone it can stand. The conditions under which a strong and noble species maintains itself, regarding spiritual discipline, are the reverse of those which govern the industrial masses, the shopkeepers à la Spencer. That which is available only to the strongest and most fruitful natures and makes their existence possible, leisure, adventure, disbelief, even dissipation would, if it were available to mediocre natures, necessarily destroy them, and actually does. This is where industriousness, rule, moderation, firm conviction have their place. In short, the herd virtues, under them this intermediate type of man grows perfect. Before we can think of acting, a tremendous amount of work has to be done. In the main, however, a shrewd exploitation of the given situation is, no doubt, our best, most advisable course of action. The actual creation of such conditions as are created by chance presupposes iron men who have never yet lived. The immediate task is to make the personal ideal prevail and become real. He who has grasped the nature of man, the origin of man's highest, shudders at man and flees from all action, consequence of inherited valuations. That the nature of man is evil, is my consolation, it guarantees strength. The typical forms of self-formation. Or, the 8 principal questions. 1. Whether one wants to be more multifarious or simpler. 2. Whether one wants to become happier or more indifferent to happiness and unhappiness. 3. Whether one wants to become more contented with oneself or more exacting and inexorable. 4. Whether one wants to become softer, more yielding, more human, or more inhuman. 5. Whether one wants to become more prudent or more ruthless. 6. Whether one wants to reach a goal or to avoid all goals, as, example, the philosopher does who smells a boundary, a yoke, a prison, a stupidity in every goal. 7. Whether one wants to become more respected or more feared, or more despised. 8. Whether one wants to become tyrant or seducer or shepherd or herd animal. The danger of dwarfing, of relaxation is present at once against Spinozistic or Epicurean happiness and against all relaxation in contemplative states. But if virtue is the means to such a happiness, very well, then one has to become master over virtue, too. I absolutely cannot see how one can later make up for having failed to go to a good school at the proper time. Such a man does not know himself, he walks through life without having learned to walk, his flabby muscles reveal themselves with every step. Sometimes life is so merciful as to offer this hard schooling once more later, sickness for years perhaps, that demands the most extreme strength of will and self-sufficiency, or a sudden calamity, affecting also one's wife and child, that compels one to a form of activity that restores energy to the slack fibers and toughness to the will to live. The most desirable thing is still under all circumstances a hard discipline at the proper time, i.e., at that age at which it still makes one proud to see that much is demanded of one. For this is what distinguishes the hard school as a good school from all others, that much is demanded, and sternly demanded, that the good, even the exceptional, is demanded as the norm, that praise is rare, that indulgence is non-existent, that blame is apportioned sharply, objectively, without regard for talent or antecedents. One needs such a school from every point of view, that applies to the most physical as well as to the most spiritual matters. It would be fatal to desire to draw a distinction here. The same discipline makes both the good soldier and the good scholar, and looked at more closely, there is no good scholar who does not have the instincts of a good soldier in his makeup. To be able to command and also proudly to obey, to stand in the ranks, but also capable at any time of leading, to prefer danger to comfort, not to weigh the permitted and the forbidden on a shopkeeper's scales, to be a foe more of the petty, sly, parasitic, than of the evil. What does one learn in a hard school? Obeying and commanding. What has been ruined by the Church's misuse of it? 1. Asceticism. One has hardly the courage so far to display its natural utility, its indispensability in the service of the education of the will. Our absurd pedagogic world, before which the useful civil servant hovers as a model, thinks it can get by with instruction, with brain drill. It has not the slightest idea that something else is needed. First, education of willpower. One devises tests for everything except for the main thing, whether one can will, whether one may promise. The young man finishes school without a single question, without any curiosity even, concerning this supreme value problem of his nature. 2. Fasting, in every sense, even as a means of preserving the delicacy of one's ability to enjoy all good things, example, occasionally to stop reading, listening to music, being pleasant. One must have fast days for one's virtues. 2. 3. The monastery, temporary isolation, accompanied by strict refusal, example of letters, a kind of most profound self-reflection and self-recovery that desires to avoid, not temptations, but duties, and escape from the daily round. A detachment from the tyranny of stimuli and influences that condemns us to spend our strength in nothing but reactions and does not permit their accumulation to the point of spontaneous activity. One should observe our scholars from close up. They think only reactively, i.e., they have to read before they can think. 4. Feasts. One has to be very coarse in order not to feel the presence of Christians and Christian values as an oppression beneath which all genuine festive feelings go to the devil. Feasts include pride, exuberance, wantonness, mockery of everything serious and philistine, a divine affirmation of oneself out of animal plenitude and perfection, one and all states which the Christian cannot honestly welcome. The feast is paganism par excellence. 5. Courage confronted with one's own nature, dressing up in moral costumes that one has no need of moral formulas in order to welcome an affect, standard, how far we can affirm what is nature in us, how much or how little we need to have recourse to morality. 6. Death. One must convert the stupid physiological fact into a moral necessity. So, to live that one can also will at the right time to die. How does one become stronger? By coming to decision slowly, and by clinging tenaciously to what one has decided. Everything else follows. The sudden and the changeable, the two species of weakness. One must learn in time to command just as much as to obey. One must learn modesty, tact in modesty, that is, to confer distinction and to honor by being modest, the same with trust, to confer distinction, to honor. I wish men would begin by respecting themselves, everything else follows from that. To be sure, as soon as one does this one is finished for others, for this is what they forgive last. What? A man who respects himself. This is something different from the blind drive to love oneself. Nothing is more common, in the love of the sexes as well as of that duality which is called I, than contempt for what one loves, fatalism in love. I want this or that, one wish that this or that were thus, I know that this or that is thus. The degrees of strength, the man of will, the man of desire, the man of faith. Never to conclude what is right for one is fair for another, but conversely. To treat requital, the permission to give back, as a privilege and a rare distinction. To have no ambition to emulate the virtues of others. Are you by instinct a warrior of attack or a warrior of defense? The remainder of mankind, all that is not warlike by instinct, wants peace, wants concord, wants freedom, wants equal rights. These are only different names and stages of the same thing. To go where one has no need to defend oneself, such men become dissatisfied with themselves if they are obliged to offer resistance. They want to 21 create conditions in which there is no longer war of any kind. If the worst comes to the worst, to submit, obey, acquiesce, anything is better than waging war thus. What will become of the man who no longer has any reasons for defending himself or for attacking? What effects does he have left if he has lost those in which lie his weapons of defense and attack? Do nothing that ought not to be done to you, prohibits actions on account of their harmful consequences. The concealed premise is that an action will always be requited. Not every action can be returned. Between actual individuals there are no equal actions, consequently no requital. When I do something, I am very far from thinking that anyone else can do much the same. It belongs to me, one cannot pay me back. It will always be another action that is perpetrated against me. Reciprocity, that in a deeper sense one never gives back, because one is something unique and does only unique things. This fundamental conviction contains the cause of aristocratic segregation from the masses, because the masses believe in equality and consequently in equivalence and reciprocity. To give one's life for a cause, a great effect. But there are many things for which one would give one's life, the effects one and all desire to be gratified. Whether it be compassion or anger or revenge that one stakes one's life on, it does not make any value difference. How many have sacrificed their lives for pretty girls and, worse, even their health? If one has the temperament, one instinctively chooses what is dangerous, example adventures in speculation if one is a philosopher, or in immorality if one is virtuous. One kind of man will risk nothing, another wants risks. Are we others despisers of life? On the contrary, we seek life raised to a higher power, life lived in danger, but that, to repeat it, does not mean we want to be more virtuous than others. Pascal, example, wanted to risk nothing and remained a Christian. Perhaps that was virtuous. One always makes sacrifices. How much advantage man sacrifices, how little self-interested he is. All his affects and passions demand their rights, and how remote from the prudent utility of self-interest is an affect. One does not desire happiness, one must be English to be able to believe that man always seeks his advantage. Our desires want to violate things with a protracted passion, their accumulated strength seeks resistance. In summa, domination of the passions, not their weakening or extirpation. The greater the dominating power of a will, the more freedom may the passions be allowed. The great man is great owing to the free play and scope of his desires, and to the yet greater power that knows how to press these magnificent monsters into service. The good man is at every stage of civilization the harmless and the useful combined, a kind of mean, the expression of the general consciousness of the kind of man whom one has no reason to fear but whom one must nonetheless not despise. Education, essentially the means of ruining the exceptions for the good of the rule. Higher education, essentially the means of directing taste against the exceptions for the good of the mediocre. Only when a culture has an excess of powers at its disposal can it also constitute a hothouse for the luxury cultivation of the exception, the experiment, of danger, of the nuance. This is the tendency of every aristocratic culture. Nothing but questions of strength, how far to prevail against the conditions that preserve society and against its prejudices, How far to unchain one's terrible qualities through which most people perish, how far to oppose truth and reflect on its most questionable sides, how far to oppose suffering, self-contempt, pity, sickness, vice, with the query as to whether one cannot become master of them. What does not destroy us makes us stronger finally, how far to acknowledge in one's mind the rule, the commonplace, the petty, good, upright, the average nature, without letting oneself be vulgarized by them, hardest test of character, not to let oneself be ruined through seduction by the good. The good as luxury, as subtlety, as vice. 3. The noble man. Type, true graciousness, nobility, greatness of soul proceeds from abundance, do not give in order to receive, do not try to exalt themselves by being gracious, prodigality as the type of true graciousness, abundance of personality as its presupposition. The presupposition inherent in an aristocratic society for preserving a high degree of freedom among its members is the extreme tension that arises from the presence of an antagonistic drive in all its members, the will to dominate. If you would do away with firm opposition and differences in rank, you will also abolish all strong love, lofty attitudes, and the feeling of individuality. Toward a true psychology of the society based on freedom and equality, what diminishes? The will to self-responsibility, sign of the decline of autonomy, efficiency in defense and attack, also in the most spiritual things, the power of commanding, the sense of reverence, subservience, ability to keep silent, great passion, the great task, tragedy, cheerfulness. What is noble? That one constantly has to play a part. That one seeks situations in which one has constant need of poses. That one leaves happiness to the great majority, happiness as peace of soul, virtue, comfort, Anglo-Angelic shopkeeperdom a la Spencer. That one instinctively seeks heavy responsibilities. That one knows how to make enemies everywhere, if the worst comes to the worst even of oneself. That one constantly contradicts the great majority not through words but through deeds. Virtue, example in the form of truthfulness, as our noble and dangerous luxury, we must not refuse the disadvantages it brings with it. For the masters of the earth. I write for a species of man that does not yet exist, for the masters of the earth. Religions, as consolations and relaxations, dangerous, man believes he has a right to take his ease. In Plato's The Excerpts it is written, each one of us would like to be master over all men, if possible, and best of all God. This attitude must exist again. From now on there will be more favorable preconditions for more comprehensive forms of dominion, whose like has never yet existed. And even this is not the most important thing, the possibility has been established for the production of international racial unions whose task will be to rear a master race, the future masters of the earth, a new, tremendous aristocracy, based on the severest self-legislation, in which the will of philosophical men of power and artist tyrants will be made to endure for millennia. Higher kind of men who, thanks to their superiority in will, knowledge, riches, and influence, employ democratic Europe as their most pliant and supple instrument for getting hold of the destinies of the earth, so as to work as artists upon man himself. Enough, the time is coming when politics will have a different meaning. 5. The great human being. Freedom of spirit, i.e., unbelief as an instinct, is a precondition of greatness. I believe that it is precisely through the presence of opposites and the feelings they occasion that the great man, the bow with the great tension, develops. Men who are destinies, who by bearing themselves bear destinies, the whole species of heroic bearers of burdens, oh, how they would like to rest from themselves for once. How they thirst for strong hearts and necks, so as to be free from what oppresses them, at least for a few hours. And how vainly they thirst, they wait, they look at everything that passes, no one approaches them with as much as a thousandth part of their suffering and passion, no one divines in what way they are waiting. At length they learn their first piece of worldly prudence, not to wait any more, and soon another one, to be genial, to be modest, from now on to endure everyone, to endure everything, in short, to endure even a little more than they have endured so far. 6. The highest man as legislator of the future. 2 distinct kinds of philosopher, 1 those who want to ascertain a complex fact of evaluations, logical or moral, 2 those who are legislators of such evaluations. The former try to master the world of the present or the past by concentrating and abridging the multiplicity of events through signs. Their aim is to make previous events surveyable, comprehensible, graspable, and usable. They assist the task of man to employ all past things for the benefit of his future. The latter, however, are commanders. They say, thus it shall be. They alone determine the whither and the wherefore, what is useful and what constitutes utility for men. They dispose of the preparatory work of scientific men, and all knowledge is for them only a means for creation. To create conditions that require stronger men who for their part need, and consequently will have, a morality, more clearly, a physical spiritual discipline, that makes them strong. Not to allow oneself to be misled by blue eyes or heaving bosoms. Greatness of soul has nothing romantic about it. And unfortunately, nothing at all amiable. One must learn from war. 1. To associate death with the interests for which one fights. That makes us venerable. 2. One must learn to sacrifice many and to take one's cause seriously enough not to spare men. 3. Rigid discipline, and to permit oneself force and cunning in war. Even cunning and disguise are needed today if such a man is to preserve himself, to keep himself aloft, in the midst of the dangerous, down-dragging currents of the age. Every attempt to endure in the present, to endure the present, every approach to the men and aims of today, he will have to atone as if it were his own special sin, and he may marvel at the concealed wisdom of his nature that, after every such attempt, at once draws him back to himself by means of sickness and bad accidents. The most difficult and highest form of man will succeed most rarely. I teach, that there are higher and lower men, and that a single individual can under certain circumstances justify the existence of whole millennia, that is, a full, rich, great, whole human being in relation to countless incomplete fragmentary men. Order of rank, he who determines values and directs the will of millennia by giving direction to the highest natures is the highest man. I believe I have guessed some of the things in the soul of the highest man. Perhaps anyone who unriddles him must perish, but whoever has seen him must help to make him possible. Fundamental thought, we must consider the future as decisive for all our evaluations and not seek the laws of our actions behind us. Not mankind but overman is the goal. How man makes himself eternal. Dante. 2 Dionysus. The formula Dionysian. Against the theory that an in itself of things must necessarily be good, blessed, true, and one, Schopenhauer's interpretation of the in itself as will was an essential step, but he did not understand how to deify this will. He remained entangled in the moral Christian ideal. Schopenhauer was still so much subject to the dominion of Christian values that, as soon as the thing in itself was no longer God for him, he had to see it as bad, stupid, and absolutely reprehensible. He failed to grasp that there can be an infinite variety of ways of being different, even of being God. A revaluation of values is achieved only when there is attention of new needs, of men with new needs, who suffer from the old values without attaining this consciousness. Conception of a new perfection, that which does not correspond to our logic, our beautiful, our good, our true, could be perfect in a higher sense than even our ideal. We no longer separate the great from the terrible. We include together the good things, in their complexity, and the worst things. We have overcome the absurd desirability of former days, which desired increase of the good without increase of the evil. What is evil? 3 things: chance, the uncertain, the sudden. How does primitive man fight against evil? He conceives it as reason, as power, even as a person. In this way he establishes the possibility of entering into a kind of treaty with it and in general to exercise influence over it in advance to forestall it. The chief kinds of pessimism, the pessimism of sensibility, excessive irritability with the preponderance of unpleasurable feelings, the pessimism of unfree will, in other words, a lack of strength in resisting stimuli, the pessimism of doubt, a distaste for everything firm, for all grasping and touching. Nihilism, the penetrating feeling of nothingness. Pleasure appears where there is the feeling of power. Happiness, in the triumphant consciousness of power and victory. Progress, the strengthening of the type, the ability for great willing. Everything else is misunderstanding, danger. Thesis, everything good is the evil of former days made serviceable. Standard, the greater and more terrible the passions are that an age, a people, an individual can permit themselves, because they are capable of employing them as means, the higher stands their culture. 81 The more mediocre, the weaker, the more submissive and cowardly a man is, the more he will posit as evil. It is with him that the realm of evil is most comprehensive. The basest man will see the realm of evil, of that which is forbidden and hostile to him, everywhere. Man is beast and super beast, the higher man is inhuman and superhuman, these belong together. With every increase of greatness and height in man, there is also an increase in depth and terribleness. One ought not to desire the one without the other, or rather, the more radically one desires the one, the more radically one achieves precisely the other. Let us remove supreme goodness from the concept of God, it is unworthy of a God. Let us also remove supreme wisdom, it is the vanity of philosophers that is to be blamed for this mad notion of God as a monster of wisdom. He had to be as like them as possible. No. God the supreme power that suffices. Everything follows from it, the world follows from it. Is it necessary to elaborate that a God prefers to stay beyond everything bourgeois and rational? And, between ourselves, also beyond good and evil? His prospect is free in Goethe's words. The type of God after the type of creative spirits, of great men. In times of painful tension and vulnerability, choose war, it hardens, it produces muscles. To what extent a stronger type of man would necessarily have to conceive the elevation and enhancement of man as taking place in another direction, higher beings, beyond good and evil, beyond those values which cannot deny their origin in the sphere of suffering. The herd and the majority. I sought in history the beginnings of this construction of reverse ideals, the concepts pagan, classical, noble newly discovered and expounded. To demonstrate to what extent the Greek religion was higher than the Judeo-Christian. The latter conquered because the Greek religion had become degenerate, had retrogressed. The word Dionysian means, an urge to unity, a reaching out beyond personality, the everyday, society, reality, across the abyss of transitoriness, a passionate painful overflowing into darker, fuller, more floating states, an ecstatic affirmation of the total character of life as that which remains the same, just as powerful, just as blissful, through all change, the great pantheistic sharing of joy and sorrow that sanctifies and calls good even the most terrible and questionable qualities of life, the eternal will to procreation, to fruitfulness, to recurrence, the feeling of the necessary unity of creation and destruction. The world Apollonian means, the urge to perfect self-sufficiency, to the typical individual, to all that simplifies, distinguishes, makes strong, clear, unambiguous, typical, freedom under the law. The further development of art is as necessarily tied to the antagonism between these two natural artistic powers as the further development of man is to that between the sexes. Plenitude of power and moderation, the highest form of self-affirmation in a cool, noble, severe beauty, the Apollinianism of the Hellenic will. This antithesis of the Dionysian and the Apollonian within the Greek soul is one of the great riddles to which I felt myself drawn when considering the nature of the Greeks. Fundamentally I was concerned with nothing except to guess why precisely Greek Apollinianism had to grow out of a Dionysian subsoil, why the Dionysian Greek needed to become Apollinian, that is, to break his will to the terrible, multifarious, uncertain, frightful, upon a will to measure, to simplicity, to submission to rule and concept. The immoderate, disorderly Asiatic lies at his roots. The bravery of the Greek consists in his struggle with his Asiaticism. Beauty is not given to him, as little as is logic or the naturalness of customs. It is conquered, willed, won by struggle. It is his victory. The eternal recurrence. A prophecy. 1. Presentation of the doctrine and its theoretical presuppositions and consequences. 2. Proof of the doctrine. 3. Probable consequences of its being believed. It makes everything break open. A. Means of enduring it. B. Means of disposing of it. 4. Its place in history as a midpoint. Period of greatest danger. Foundation of an oligarchy above peoples and their interests, education to a universally human politics. Counterpart of Jesuitism. If the world had a goal, it must have been reached. If there were for it some unintended final state, this also must have been reached. If it were in any way capable of a pausing and becoming fixed, of being, if in the whole course of its becoming it possessed even for a moment this capability of being, then all becoming would long since have come to an end, along with all thinking, all spirit. The fact of spirit as a form of becoming proves that the world has no goal, no final state, and is incapable of being. It is still the old religious way of thinking and desiring, a kind of longing to believe that in some way the world is after all like the old beloved, infinite, boundlessly creative God, that in some way the old God still lives. What, then, is the law and belief with which the decisive change, the recently attained preponderance of the scientific spirit over the religious, God-inventing spirit, is most clearly formulated? Is it not, the world, as force, may not be thought of as unlimited, for it cannot be so thought of. We forbid ourselves the concept of an infinite force as incompatible with the concept force. Thus the world also lacks the capacity for eternal novelty. If the world could in any way become rigid, dry, dead, nothing, or if it could reach a state of equilibrium, or if it had any kind of goal that involved duration, immutability, the once and for all, in short, speaking metaphysically, if becoming could resolve itself into being or into nothingness, then this state must have been reached. But it has not been reached, from which it follows this is the sole certainty we have in our hands to serve as a corrective to a great host of world hypotheses possible in themselves. If, example, the mechanistic theory cannot avoid the consequence, drawn for it by William Thomson, of leading to a final state, then the mechanistic theory stands refuted. The world as a circular movement that has already repeated itself infinitely often and plays its game in infinitum. This conception is not simply a mechanistic conception, for if it were that, it would not condition an infinite recurrence of identical cases, but a final state. Because the world has not reached this, mechanistic theory must be considered an imperfect and merely provisional hypothesis. And do you know what the world is to me? Shall I show it to you in my mirror? This world, a monster of energy, without beginning, without end, a firm, iron magnitude of force that does not grow bigger or smaller, that does not expend itself but only transforms itself, as a whole, of unalterable size, a household without expenses or losses, but likewise without increase or income, enclosed by nothingness as by a boundary, not something blurry or wasted, not something endlessly extended, but set in a definite space as a definite force, and not a space that might be empty here or there, but rather as force throughout, as a play of forces and waves of forces, at the same time one and many, increasing here and at the same time decreasing there, a sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing, eternally flooding back, with tremendous years of recurrence, with an ebb and a flood of its forms, out of the simplest forms striving toward the most complex, out of the stillest, most rigid, coldest forms toward the hottest, most turbulent, most self-contradictory. And then again returning home to the simple out of this abundance, out of the play of contradictions back to the joy of concord, still affirming itself in this uniformity of its courses and its years, blessing itself as that which must return eternally, as a becoming that knows no satiety, no disgust, no weariness, this, my Dionysian world of the eternally self-creating, the eternally self-destroying, this mystery world of the twofold voluptuous delight, my beyond good and evil, without goal. Unless the joy of the circle is itself a goal, without will, unless a ring feels goodwill toward itself, do you want a name for this world? A solution for all its riddles. A light for you, too, you best concealed, strongest, most intrepid, most midnightly men, this world is the will to power and nothing besides. And you yourselves are also this will to power and nothing besides.